thank you very much for coming along. And this evening we're going to look at part 2 of a series that we've been talking about in terms of where can we turn to learn, particularly in the time of abrupt change. Abrupt change is any change that happens more quickly than you're prepared for it. There's no specific hard measure, that is to say in hours, seconds, or minutes, of what abrupt means. It has to do with the relative capacity to cope. Something is abrupt when you're not ready for it, when it's happening faster than you thought, or happening faster than anybody thought, or anyone was capable of predicting. This is the circumstance we find ourselves in right now in reference to the changing climate, the changing environment in general, being driven by climate change. And in effect, we're looking at a circumstance where we're needing to learn in circumstances of abrupt shift. So it's not clear that the lessons from the past are good guides to how we should proceed in the future. And certainly lessons from the intermediate past, from when you were young, for example, or younger, or for that matter, what your parents told you. It's not clear that these are self-evidently true. You've got to learn, as it were, on the run. And the question is, where do we turn to learn in these kinds of circumstances? So we're actually going to look at that as an issue in terms of planning for a sustainable future on a finite planet. Where can we turn to learn in the midst of abrupt change? So say this is part 2, you've seen the previous part before, and if not, you can look it up in the archives on transition studies. Well, one of the things that's happened in the last few months is that Greta has come to the United States. She sailed into our lives for a while, and a 16-year-old from Sweden traveled the Atlantic on a sailing ship in order not to use fossil fuels, and at this point she's sailed back. She's now sailed out of our lives in some respects, but she's had a kind of global impact that's worth remembering. As they say in the articles and the TV broadcast, eco-activists leaving U.S. But some large questions remain after she departs. Now that Greta is gone, what next? What next? She taught us a lot while she was here, much more than we thought. It wasn't that she was a new voice in climate science. What she was a new voice for climate science, explained to congressmen, celebrities, students, or anybody who would listen, that they should be taking the scientific studies seriously. She herself is not a scientist, but she's taking seriously what they're saying about, as she said, our house is on fire. That requires response because it's an emergency. Well, we want to look at what have we learned from this world-famous school dropout. She became famous because she started striking against going to school on Fridays outside the Swedish Parliament, and said she'd continue doing that every Friday until they started to do something. So it was the school strike for climate. That was a campaign that took on real proportions in Sweden itself, and then increasingly around the European continent and now around the world. What's next, and from now on, what can we learn not only from her presence, but where can we turn to learn? Now that she's gone back to Europe, sailed away again, where can we turn to learn? Well, we can keep in touch with what she's doing online because she's now such a personality that the news media will follow her with daily reports. But let's first look then at this question of what have we learned from this world-famous school dropout while she was here. It's pretty staggering, actually, what we've learned, because it's far more than she thought she was teaching. If you've been paying any attention, you'll realize that she's taught us a great deal. Even her departure has been marked by important events. As you can see from the screen on CBS Morning America, it's announced at the same time that she leaves that impeachment hearings are beginning, and the coverage will be available today at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Impeachment hearings begin. Now, she couldn't have known that at the time she got on the boat to go back to Europe, but it's interesting and maybe even indicative that she's smiling at this. Actually, Greta crossed paths with the President of the United States, President Trump, at the UN. There's sort of documentary evidence of her scowling at him from the sidelines at the meetings of the heads of state at the UN when she was here, and also addressing the heads of state. But it was a very interesting encounter in some ways, because the Washington Post captured the footage and published it on their websites and around the world. But predictably, the tweeter-in-chief felt moved to mock her in a characteristically ironic tweet. She seems like a very happy young girl, looking forward to a bright and wonderful future. So nice to see. Donald J. Trump, tweeter-in-chief. Well, by way of response, Greta updated her profile on her own Twitter account to reflect the president's wise observations, his wisdom. A very happy young girl looking forward to a bright and wonderful future is the way she now describes herself, in President Trump's precise words. It's not clear that Trump has ever read her tweet, or would even get the sense of irony that she's mimicking in her response to his tweet. But he may not read tweets, he just writes them. We may never know, probably will never know, but it may well have been true that she smiled in delight at the news headlines that were broadcast as she was leaving. Impeachment hearing coverage begins. Well, actually, if the tweeter-in-chief had bothered to pay attention, he could have learned a lot from the 16-year-old who sailed into our lives and then sailed out again. It's not clear he did pay attention, but had he paid attention, he would have learned a lot about his own area of what he thinks of his expertise, politics. Take a look.
As many as 4 million people took to the streets around the world Friday in the largest day of action focused on the climate crisis. Students across the globe participated in a climate strike inspired by the 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. Just over a year ago, Greta began skipping classes to protest in front of the Swedish parliament, demanding action to prevent catastrophic climate change. Her protest inspired millions around the world. On Friday, she joined the climate strike in New York City ahead of today's UN Climate Action Summit. Later in the show, we'll hear Greta in her own words, but first we turn to more voices from Friday's protests. We begin with Varshini Prakash, co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement, and climate activist Vic Barrett, addressing climate strikers in Foley Square as the march began.
Okay, well, one of the first things you'd learn is that she, during her speeches and her rallies, mobilized more than 4 million people around the world, right? 4 million young people around the world, simultaneously in touch with each other through Twitter accounts, through Facebook accounts, through live streaming video through YouTube. This woman mobilized the largest climate demonstration in human history, right? Within a year of starting a school strike in Sweden. Pretty extraordinary achievement to begin with. And you'll see, as the coverage of Democracy Now! Makes clear, group after group in town and city after city has taken the inspiration from Greta to organize their own demonstrations and their own enduring institutions, like the Sunrise Movement. Take a look. It's really quite impressive.
Vic Barrett, Nidive, Garifuna, Nuguya. Vic Barrett is my name. I am Garifuna. My people are an Afro-Indigenous community from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. Despite overwhelming adversity, we organized our community and emancipated ourselves from colonization. My ancestors did this to protect the children to come. I am one of those children. But the struggle continues for me and my people. Again, we are being pushed from the lands which we settled, the lands that my family has inhabited for generations. That land will be underwater in a few decades if we continue on the path we're on. I was born into a world in which my future is being stolen from me. Born into a world in which my past already was. Born into a world where everything that I am is slipping into the sea. Born into a world where my people face extinction. Indigenous lands all over our planet are being flooded, poisoned, and destroyed. My black brothers and sisters are being gunned down by police. Migrant children are dying at the border. Trans folks are being murdered. Violence is in the air that we breathe. The spectacular violence of the police on marginalized people and the slow violence of dispossession and disenfranchisement on those same communities. Some would think that there's no more room for destruction. But I think that all of us here know that for decades, our government and governments around the world have consciously put policies in place that have caused the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. An emerging crisis threatening my generation with untold violence. But this is an old story, right? A story that we're tired of hearing, right? That is why we're here. We're here to write a new story. A story in which our country is doing everything in its power to address not only the climate crisis, but the systemic injustices at its roots. A story in which our constitutional right to a safe climate is recognized by the highest courts. A story in which the most vulnerable people are given the greatest protections. A story in which indigenous peoples are empowered to protect their homelands. In 2030, the history books will show that faced with imminent destruction, people on the front lines fought back.
Okay, people on the front lines fought back. In this case, being inspired by a Swedish school dropout. At age 15, started a movement to school strike, traveled across the Atlantic to be received by a whole series of similar groups and have a new narrative. The new narrative is what's being born here. Not one that she spun, but the one that people are telling about their own circumstances. This is, in effect, something that we've got to pay attention to because it will go on for generations to come. You could ask yourself, what if Greta had stayed in school? What would she have missed? What is the education system designed to do? Well, Noam Chomsky has expressed himself on this for years.
Said a lot about the role of the media in a so-called democracy. I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class, and you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity, probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's what you'd expect, right? People at the Yales and the Harvards and the MITs are better able to do this conformity thing, so they, in effect, get promoted. They move through the system. And since that was what the system is all about, it's little wonder, in the face of how educational institutions operate, it's little wonder that Greta launched the school strike against that, because it's precisely that stupefaction of the educational system, the dumbing down of the curiosity and concern and urgent sense of crisis that students have naturally. It's the drumming that out of them that is the job of the educational institutions, quote unquote. What if she had gotten as far as Harvard and to some of the other top universities, not just Harvard, and asked some questions? Well, you can ask it from Dan Schrag, head of Harvard Center for the Environment. He actually talks about sea level rise. Take a look.
This is a big challenge. So what I want to talk about today now is two types of solutions to climate change. I wish I could provide with a techno fix that would solve all of the climate problems and I could make you all think this problem is going to go away. That isn't the case. There is no single solution to this problem. This is a big problem, and the scale of our energy system that is causing this problem is huge. And so I'm not going to be able to solve all of this. I want to talk about two things, one at a very local scale and one at a very global scale. At a local scale, I want to talk about the problem of sea level rise in Boston. Here's a picture that Applied Science Associates did a few years ago of what flooding from a 100-year storm would do with only a 0.6 meter sea level rise. It's pretty bad for Boston, right? I've been talking with people at Harvard about this because Harvard is building a new campus in Alston only about 1.5 meters above sea level. And Harvard actually, is planning on putting a lot of money into this campus and expects it to be around for another 300 years. Well, 300 years now, you're talking about serious sea level rise. And you have to think about this. But one of the things I think I convinced the planners was that solving this problem by raising the buildings in Alston for the new campus wouldn't matter much if the whole neighborhood was underwater, right? Now, luckily, Boston turns out to be a very special place, much better than many other cities around the US that are near the coast. There's actually one really sensitive spot in Boston.
Now, this is interesting. There's one really sensitive spot in Boston, according to Dan Schrag, head of the Harvard Environment Program, right? One really sensitive spot. Take a look at how he explains it.
I'm not sure that I can help the entire waterfront area, but in fact...
Okay, he can't help the waterfront area, the area that faces the ocean, the area where a lot of people live and even more people work, right? People commute into work in this area. I'm sure he's not sure he can help them, but take a look.
Most of the Boston area is really accessed through the Charles River Basin.
Now that's a very interesting proposition. If Greta had made it to Harvard and listened to the head of the environment program, she would have learned from him that most of the Boston area is accessed through the Charles River Basin. Maybe. Maybe not. Take a look at the map. Take a look at what he says.
And there's something here called the Charles River Dam. We take it for granted, the Charles River Dam. What it does is it protects the Charles River from the tidal fluctuations in the ocean and vice versa. So it basically keeps, when the ocean's higher than the river, it keeps the river from getting flooded with salt water, and when the river is higher than the ocean, it keeps the river from draining out all of a sudden. So it's a very effective system. I don't know if any of you have taken those duck boats through the locks. It's a great thing to do. Turns out that the height of the Charles River Dam, which was rebuilt in '78, originally it was built in 1910, is only 1.5 feet above the historic highest tide ever experienced. Only 1.5 feet. So what I said to the Alston planners for Harvard was, the thing we should do is we should get together with MIT and a few of the other local universities and get some people from Boston and Cambridge and actually make a plan to raise the height of the Charles River Dam. We don't have to do this next year. It's not an emergency. Sea level rise isn't going to happen in 5 years. But over the next 10 or 20 years, we should put a plan in place to put 2 meters of additional protection in Boston. And actually, that would take care of the sea level problem for Boston.
Oh, now that's interesting. He says, actually, that would take care of the sea level problem for Boston. Well, if Greta had come along and listened to this from Harvard's head of the Center for the Environment, she might have been a little disappointed, because what he was talking about was storm surge, not sea level rise. Well, if she couldn't have learned from the professors, at least she could have learned from the graduate students around here. They've all figured out how to learn from a whole range of universities, and have set up their own things on computers to draw in Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, Oxford, from all over the world. So we have to ask ourselves from now on, where can we turn to learn? Where should we turn to learn? And can we expect it from universities? Well, in fact, for a long time, institutes on their own, well independent of universities, have led the way in both research and teaching about the global environment and about climate change. The World Watch Institute is very important in this respect, and then 50 years ago it was founded, and they in fact have been awarded by Harvard a great prestigious award to Lester Brown, the founder of it, recognizing that he was way out in front of them on this issue. Further, there have been discussions about the humanities and how they can help with what's coming, looking particularly at narratives of change. Now, you recall the gentleman from St. Vincent, the island in the Caribbean, was talking about new narratives. Perhaps with a little historical perspective, we could learn something about the importance of values in revolutionary times. Dickens could teach us something, in fact. As this cartoon puts it, I wish you would make up your mind, Mr. Dickens. Was it the best of times, or was it the worst of times? It could scarcely have been both. Well, it takes a novelist to point out it could precisely be both. Harvard used to have courses in environmental ethics, but these have been discontinued now. So Greta would have had to gone beyond Harvard for the look at environmental ethics. But just yesterday, she would have seen evidence of her own moral impact on the Harvard and Yale environment. Harvard and Yale students, in effect, disrupted the sacred football game for a fossil fuel protest, pointing out that this is an emergency, pointing out to both President Bacow and the President of Yale that she's had an impact, even after she sailed away. Well, where can we turn to learn? We can start to turn to learn to these independent institutes. These internet institutes are doing now online what Lester Brown accomplished over 50 years through the World Watch Institute. Take a look at things like the Transition Studies Internet Institute. Why? Well, because they're looking at the transitions that are going to need to be made. Take a look.
We're a fossil fuel dependent civilization, independent of what nationality we are. Our modern civilization is dependent on fossil fuels. We have to get to being a solar sustainable system. There's a bit of a transition, right? Transition studies are what's now in every discipline, every department, every university.
And it's that transition that we need to start learning about quickly. In other words, it's not any longer a question of just talking about things in university seminars or the like. It's a desperate transition that we need to make to a world that can survive in effect, an abruptly changing environment. If you look at it, if human civilization is to survive, we must all learn to make the transition to a solar sustainable world.